All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Asia Pacific Awards for Excellence 2023 briefing session. To start things off, some housekeeping rules. Friendly reminder that this will be recorded and will be posted up on the awards webpage once available. Please save your questions for the Q&A portion of this webinar. And thank you again for joining us. Without further ado, I turn over the presentation to Colin.
Okay, thanks very much, Camille, and welcome everyone to our annual roundup of the awards session to brief people about how and when and what type of projects they might want to enter. I'm joined today by Dan Surf, who is a member of the jury, and Dan will be helping us out with any questions you have and may wade in as we go along with any observations for the things that we're going to cover this morning. Right, can we start? Next slide, please, Camille. As Camilla said, just submit any questions you have in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. You should be able to access simultaneous interpretation, so I think there's one in Chinese at any rate, if you need that facility. And the next one, please. Okay, so Awards for Excellence program has been actually going on for quite a long time in the US. In the Asia Pacific, it's been introduced for the last 5 years, although there were 1 or 2 examples even before that in which we held a competition. But as far as this particular sequence of awards programs is concerned, this is the 5th year. And we generally get between 50 and 80 submissions at any given time. Of those, we might choose, say, 20 that proceed to the finalist stage, and beyond that, we might have anywhere between, say, 12 and 13 that are nominated as winners. That can vary. We don't actually have any particular threshold. As long as projects are able to meet the required standard, then they're going to be given the award. It is a prestigious award. We consider it certainly to be the #1 flagship awards program in the world. And certainly in the Asia Pacific, I don't think that there are others that would challenge us. Okay, next one, please, Kim. So as I mentioned, we have the Asia Pacific program, but there are also other programs that go on elsewhere in the world. So we have a program also in the United States and one in Europe. And once these 3 competitions are conducted, they are actually not necessarily held at the same time, but the winners of each of the 3 different regional competitions are then automatically progressed to the global awards program, which you can see here on the right on this chart. So that then becomes a separate competition, sort of like the winners of the best of the best. And we then proceed to choose globally which are the which are the winners that stand out the most. I think last year we had 2 from Asia Pacific that won the global award, and the year before that I think we had 5. So again, it's another filter to choose the very best of those projects to go through and be recognized. So this is our jury. We have, I think, this year some 14 people on the jury, and as you can see, they're spread across different markets by geography. We do this so that people are familiar with, you know, the markets in their own backyards, rather than to have people all collected in one place, and also so that once the projects proceed to the finalist stage, then it's that much easier for us to go ahead and do the site visits. This is how it works. We have the first meeting of the jury, which takes place in this case around the end of this month. I think it's 29th of March. Correct me if I'm wrong, Keneal. Once that's a 2-day session. Once those deliberations are finished, as I said, we choose around perhaps 20 winners. At that point, the jury heads off into the relevant places to go and visit each project and assess it personally. They get a site tour. They're able to get a real personal, hands-on feel for what each project looks like, and then assess it properly. We then have a second jury meeting, which in this case will be around the end of April, about one month later, in other words, where the jury then has further discussions and debates as to which projects are deserving to become winners. And after that, of course, we announced the winners during our annual summit, which this year will be end of May in Singapore. So there will be one or two sessions where the awards are actually handed out, in another session where we will do a quick tour of the different winning projects and give some relatively brief description, probably 3 or 4 minutes each, to allow the attendees at the summit to get an idea of what kind of projects have won and are able to win. Just going down them by geography, you'll see we have 2 Australia, 3 in China. China probably has the lion's share of the submissions, probably around 30%, I would say, of all of the submissions that we get come from China. Very popular there. 2 in Hong Kong, 2 in Singapore, although you see we have 3 listed there. There's one of them, Anupam Yog, who's actually also oriented towards our India project, so he's actually based in Singapore. A couple in Japan, and then 1 each for the Philippines and South Korea. Okay, next one, please, Camille. Right, the next few slides, we're going to take a look at some of the projects that have, over the years, won awards, just to give you an idea of the typology that very often we get, and what kinds of features that you see in projects that stand out for the jury. And I'll go through afterwards as well to give some tips about what makes for a good submission and what kind of tactics you can employ in filling out your application form to give you the best chance of success. Okay, next slide, please. Right, well, the first one we'll look at is a project in Japan. This is in Tokyo. One of the larger developers in Tokyo. There's probably 4 or 5 big ones in the Japanese market. But you tend to see various areas of Tokyo that are dominated by some of these larger developers. And in this case, we have a renovation of the Takashimaya department store in central Tokyo, which was carried out. It's a listed building, I think. It's carried out with a great deal of sensitivity. But what's interesting about this project is not simply the work that was done to that facility, but also the fact that the entire area around the department store was upgraded or renovated or regenerated at the same time. And an example of a way in which the developer can sort of take over or at least boost the work of the government in regenerating urban core areas. So in this case, you had you see in the back, there are a couple of office buildings and several city blocks, in fact, that were involved with this renovation. There are various shops that were regenerated on the street level. Connectivity was improved along the various pathways that link the streets in this area. And in general, it was done in a way that was sensitive, that was sustainable, and that was oriented towards boosting the community in this entire area. So it's not just a project in this case that's aimed at improving the real estate that's owned by the developer or by the owner of this patch of land. It's one that's oriented at improving it for all of the people that happen to visit this area, both the shop owners and the tourists and the office workers and all the rest. So it's very much a community-oriented project rather than just being a single real estate project. Okay, next one, please, Camille. Okay, next one. This was in Singapore. This is an example of a project at scale, not simply, again, a single building or even a single area within a city core or within an urban area, but in fact, an entire urban area in itself. This is one of Singapore's new towns. It's a reflection of a strategy on the part of the Singapore government to expand the city beyond the urban core, the old CBD, into other areas around the island, and to develop those for the purposes of helping people in those areas, and to allow the city to spread out and to give people a bit more space. There are, I think, 23 or so of these new towns, and this one is, I think, among the most, if not the most recent one to have been developed. Has something like 300,000 people. So again, it does go to show that we're not looking simply at individual projects, but also ones which can be regenerated or created out of, in this case, a greenfield site. And this has been done, as often happens in Singapore, with a great deal of planning and a great deal of competence and a great deal of sensitivity in all the various factors and the way in which, as sort of a Lego project, different aspects of urban planning were plugged into this to make this something that works in a holistic way. So you have the transportation aspect, where there's a train line linking this site, which is on the other side of the island from the downtown into the downtown. You also have transit systems within Punggol, which link the various neighborhoods by tram in this case. You also have, on an even more microcosm basis, bicycle paths and pedestrian paths that link various aspects of the city, or I should say the town. It's made up of individual neighborhoods, which are in themselves self-contained, so they are quite walkable, and within, say, 15 minutes, the idea is that you can reach from your apartments the various aspects or facilities that you might need day to day. So your schools, your shops, your public facilities, they're all there, and created in a way that's convenient for the residents. Also, it's known as a tech-friendly town, so there's all kinds of smart features, both in terms of the individual buildings that are given smart access, the smart lighting. You have various smart electricity features, and on a wider scale, so that the local government's able to keep track of what's needed to maintain the town in an efficient way. Also, you can see on the map, there's a river effectively that's being created through the middle of the town, linking a couple of reservoirs on each side, and that has given residents access to waterfront space. Very unusual, I think, in these types of towns, where usually it tends to be gentrified. People are clustered in the more expensive properties on the coast. In this case, that's been addressed by creating this extra waterfront to the center of the town. And in general, a very efficient, very successful example of a greenfield from the ground up, large-scale urban development. Okay, Keneal, next slide. Okay, so this is another couple of projects, one in China and, in fact, both in China in this case. Can we get next slide, please, Keneal? The first one is in Sichuan. We do get quite a few projects that come to us from the western part of China, or from second and third tier cities in China. It doesn't have to be from Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou. And this one, as I say, from Sichuan, a small town called Suining. And this is, as I say, an example of an open space project in terms of a regeneration of a riverfront in a relatively small city. In the past, the cities have grown up in China, and I suppose elsewhere. There hasn't necessarily been much focus on how riverfronts can be used as a facility for the community. Very often they're simply built up for purposes of transport or for purely pragmatic or practical purposes, rather than, as I say, to create a facility. So in this case, what the government did was to create an area of riverfront that stretched along, I think, 4 kilometers of the center of the town, and basically regenerated it to create a linear park that can be used by local residents. And at the same time, it was quite sensitive and focused on regenerating the landscape and the ecology of the river by bringing in local types of vegetation, by creating swales or ponds that can flood at different times of the year as the river level rises and falls, and create a wetland where different types of fauna, different types of fish, different types of insects, amphibians can live. So it's very much oriented not simply as a facility for individual residents, but also as a wetland, so that it has an environmental and ecological purpose. And it was created not at a huge cost, but in a very sensitive and successful way. It's also an example, I think, of a way in which projects might be financed in a successful way, and that the government in this case has compensated the developer of the project by giving it land in some other part of the city nearby, where it can then develop and create profit for itself and be compensated for the work that it's done in creating this facility. So it's a fairly ingenious way of creating a major facility for the public in a way that's affordable for the city, without having to dip into the coffers and spend too much money. Okay, next one, please, Kim. Right, and this is a project in Shanghai. This one, I think, was one of the two projects that won the global awards last year, quite apart from being a winner in Asia Pacific. And it's also a good example of the fact that your project doesn't need to be a big, fancy, expensive project. It's not only the big developers that win these projects or that are able to win projects. This is a really fairly small one. It's a building in central Shanghai, around 6 stories high, I think, together with the continuous area around it, a few alleyways and basically 1 block, I think, on either side, which were regenerated. This was an old factory building. At the time in which it was bought up by the developer in this case, it was, I think, derelict, as were most of the facilities in the nearby area. And the developer took it over after negotiating with the government as to how it was going to be regenerated, and has created a grouping of different office spaces to go in here. There's a co-working space. There's some artistic-oriented spaces, photographer studio. Also on the ground floor, some food and beverage facilities, so that it attracts people to hang out on the ground floor for lunch and create a fair amount of traffic. It's also been renovated in the overall area in a way that's sympathetic to the history of the area. So the local alleyways, for example, that are so typical of Shanghai in the older days, have been retained. So you have the feel of older Shanghai. As I say, done quite successfully in that case. You can see on the right, the pictures on the inside show that they've retained as much as possible the old detailing, the brickworks, are showing from the roof space, together with more modern approach inside in terms of lighting and office spacing and overall office use. So it was overall a very successful project that was carried out, it has to be said, probably on a smaller budget than larger developers would throw at a project like this. So again, the jury will be sensitive to the fact that very often projects may not involve a lot of money. If your developer or your investor in this doesn't have that much money to throw around, then if you're able to approach the redevelopments or the developments of your project in a way that is imaginative and that ticks the right boxes, and that still allows users to occupy and use the facility in a successful way, then it's quite capable that you can win an award. All right, Camille, next slide. Okay, so we'll turn from individual examples of projects to a quick rundown of how you can actually file your submissions. And this is on the left here, the screenshot of our website. Basically, everything is done over the internet. There's a web page here, ULI Asia Pac Award for Excellence. You can link to this through the e-blasts that we send out to members. They'll come in your email, and otherwise through the ULI Asia Pac site. You can easily find this by Google. On the screen, there's the big green button there that says submit your project. Once you hit that button, you'll be taken into the portal for the application, which is run by a third party. If you're a ULI member, then you'll just get taken straight through there once you log in. If you're not a ULI member, then you can also join the competition without actually joining the ULI. You again press that button, and that will take you through to another page where you will create a login, and then you'll use the login to access the open water site where you can file your submissions. Also on the site, you will see examples of the submissions form. So you don't need to go through directly to create a submission in order to understand what's required. There are submission forms there that are in English, also in Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. And you'll also see a copy of the submission guidelines, which are fairly in-depth briefing about how you can create your application, the rules you need to follow, much the same as I've been speaking about now, except in rather more detail. Yeah, and then after that, we can go onto the next slide, I think. Okay, well, actually, this is the Q&A section. I was actually going to talk a little bit more about what's involved in terms of what you need in order to file your submission. Apart from filling in the application form, there is a presentation that's needed from each entrant. And the presentation, which is a PowerPoint presentation, sometimes people want to submit these in a PDF format, which we discourage. We want all of them to be on PowerPoint, so please just give us your PowerPoint presentation. It needs to be about the right length, would be 20 or so slides. I don't want to go into too much detail on all this. This is set out in the submission guidelines, but I think it's probably useful for me to give you a few tips about what makes for a successful presentation, because there are some mistakes that we see time and again, which would be fairly easily addressed, and which certainly make your presentation better if you follow them. So the first one is that don't make your decks too long. As I say, 20 slides though is about right. You don't want it to be too short because that's not enough space to put in all the relevant details, and you don't want to go too long. And if you give us a deck that's say 50 slides long, it's just not enough time for the jury to look at it and to do justice to all of the different material, no matter how good it is. You have to remember that if we have, in this case, say 60 or more entries for the whole competition, then the jury only has maybe 10 or 15 minutes to look at each individual presentation. And discuss it as well. And on that basis, if you have dozens and dozens of different slides and too much information, then it's information overload, and you actually decrease your chance of winning rather than increasing it. So it's not a question of more, it's better. Keep your decks short. Also, you don't want to have too many photos on one slide. Sometimes you can have one photo, that's plenty if it's a strong image. 2, 3, or 4 is about right. You want to use photos rather than to have renderings or diagrams, although you do want to show a map and a plan of your project at the beginning. All of that, again, is set out in the guidelines. But generally use photos, and also make sure that your photos contain people. Sometimes I think it's probably a perspective of the architect's view that they want to show just the project. They want to show the architecture. They want to show the design. And sure, it is about design. The design is one consideration, But a more important consideration in these cases is that the jury can see that the project is successful. In other words, that it's being used. And so you want to show people, as many people as you can, that are actually using the project. A big empty room is not going to impress the jury, that's for sure. So fill it up with people and show your project that's in use rather than empty. Another tip is don't use too much data on your photos. Again, it clutters it up. It's not something that the jury is going to be able to see, given that they're only going to spend probably a few seconds looking at each photo. The data belongs in your application, and it will be read by the juror who is assigned to look in detail at your application, and all of the relevant information will be addressed and will be digested. So keep your presentation as a photo story rather than as a story that uses data. Also, don't use renderings. We sometimes get applications that show the renderings of what the project is going to look like, or maybe will look like once it's completed. Projects should be completed before it's entered into the competition. And we don't really want to see what the project should look like in the architect's eye view. We want to see what it looks like in practice and how it's being used and seen in real life. And finally, show both inside and outside views. You want to show how the project sits within the overall area, the community. So you want to show it within its environment, with the street lines around it, with the pedestrian pathways around it. And of course, we want to see what's going on inside. Again, we want to see what the design is like inside, how the public is using it. If it's an office, we want to see what the offices look like. If it's retail, what the retail facilities look like, and so on and so on. So a good balance of inside and outside photos is important. And then just to give you a brief outline of some of the criteria that the jury will look at. You want projects that are financially viable, which means that they need to have been in operation for some amount of time. They need to be mainly complete, or in terms of, sorry, I should say substantially complete, which means in fact that it needs to be completely complete unless projects are being constructed in phases, in which case we'll take a completed phase as being a satisfactory element. Need to be distinctive and innovative. They need to have a meaningful impact on the community. So again, it's not just the fact that the building is great, that it's been done in a way which is very sophisticated, a lot of money thrown at it. Needs to fit in with the community, needs to address the community's concerns. It needs to be replicable. In other words, it needs to have features that if someone else is looking at it and trying to take lessons from it, that they can use those features for another project somewhere else down the line. And that's a typical feature of a successful project, is that it can be replicated elsewhere. And increasingly these days, we want to see projects that show sustainability features, of course. Everyone wants to be green these days, and jury will be looking and will certainly give extra points to projects that show sustainability factors within the overall design and usage. Okay, I think at this point we can move it over to Q&A. I think I don't want to dominate the conversation by droning on endlessly. So Camille, if you've got any questions that have come in, can you just let us hear them, please?
If I can just jump in here, Colin, I just wanted to emphasize to the people that are making submissions that although a lot of these submissions would be made by design professionals, this is not an architectural or interior design competition. This is the Urban Land Institute, which, as Colin did mention, our focus is on the criteria, as he mentioned in the final part of his presentation. We do place a high regard on the positive impact on the community. and the promoting of the engagement of those projects. And certainly, by all means, in any of the presentations that are submitted, to articulate whatever obstacles that were encountered and what problem solving solutions and how those concerns were addressed. That helps us to be able to get a better feel for it relative to just on the back of taking a look at the project itself. So we do give certain credit for what moves were made to make these kind of contributions. Similarly, there's the other aspect of the solution as a contributor, not just that local community, but the community as wider in a wider sense. So do by all means indicate relative to its ways in which it has been able to support in certain elements of the labor market relative to its ability to draw new purchasers, new vendors, new business, and new livelihood to the areas in which it resides.
Mm. Well, Dan, can I ask you about one issue that comes up all the time, and is constantly discussed by the jury in the meetings, is question of stabilisation. How can project be? How stabilized do projects need to be in order to enter it, and how can they show that they're stabilized?
Right. It's a good question. I mean, obviously, year after year, it does come up. We do make it a criteria. One, to eliminate anyone thinking that projects can be submitted in the design stage. That is not the idea. If it is newly completed, by all means, if it is fully underwritten from the very beginning, and occupants commence practically immediately. We have seen projects that are urban projects that are just immediately upon finishing, and they have some transport link to them, and they're thriving immediately. So that might be one that could be submitted a bit sooner after its completion per se. Everybody would be moving in very quickly. But kind of a normal rule of thumb would be something along the lines of about 1 year post-completion, so that we can see how projects are being able to develop in terms of their acceptance by the market, and to some extent their financial viability.
Okay, so a couple of questions we have coming in now. First one is, we have a project substantially complete and have only renders at the moment. With what you shared, maybe we should wait till next year. Okay, well, this is a situation that happens quite a lot. Architects or developers always want to show off the new project. Obviously, it's at the forefront of their mind once they've completed it, and so they want to submit straight away. I mean, as Dan said, it's fairly standard for this to happen. But generally, unless it's a project that doesn't require any financial components to show stabilization. For example, if it's an open space project and it's just for public purposes, then it's not going to be good enough to just show that it's complete and that it's a great project. It really needs to have a bit of a track record, in which case it is better to submit it the next year. And in some cases, we do get projects that are thrown out or rejected by the jury because they're not stabilized, in which case we do sometimes also have the same project submitted in the next year or maybe in subsequent years, which is okay to do, because at that point they will then be stabilized and it can then be assessed on its merits. So we've had projects which we have been turned down in the past from lack of stabilization. They then applied the following year and then they won. So it's something that is not that unusual in itself, but probably better to wait until your project is stabilized rather than to submit it too early. Right. So another question here, for an open space application, is it okay if we don't have very much real estate numbers for the adjacent buildings? By which I think you must mean the buildings that are created in developments next to the park. Dan, do you want to comment on that?
Actually, I think there is an element of relevance, but we would be looking at the project and the project alone. So if you could show ways in which the open space has added value to those particular other projects, we don't necessarily need to see their performance, but if you can just give an indication that there has been an improvement of the footfall or the usage altogether, then that would be a plus. Again, this is part of how the project itself has contributed to the community. Again, it's one where I don't believe you would need to go through too much gymnastics, so to speak, to figure out what the performance is of your surrounding environment. Albeit that if you're looking at some kind of cost benefit base and what particularly for community projects as open spaces normally are, that would be relevant. So if you have it and you want to put it in, by all means, but it would be more data that we would be looking at relative to the engagement, not necessarily on the other sites as opposed to the one that you're submitting yourself.
Okay, there's a question here, an interesting one, asking why we need a PowerPoint format rather than a PDF format, as it's probably more difficult to ensure that your PowerPoint format will display correctly. This is true, and actually it's a good question. The answer is that when we create the deck for the jury to see these the presentations, they are put inside one large PowerPoint. And in that basis, if we're going to try and see what did I say there, Dan? Did I say the wrong word? We have one large.
No, it's a very large PowerPoint because we do have separate projects, but again, it becomes we have to jockey all of those projects, and there are quite a few. So
yeah. So if we have to,
even with the ULI's good hands about how to manage it.
Yeah. So basically, it's difficult from a practical point of view to include a PDF within our large PowerPoint file. So then you have to close the PowerPoint, open the PDF in a separate browser, and then once we look at it in the PDF, throw that out and then reopen the PowerPoint. It takes a bit of time. It's difficult from a practical point of view to implement. So that's why we want to have the PowerPoint rather than the PDF. Another question here, can the architect of our project apply for this award instead of the developer and then pay by the developer? Answer is yes. It doesn't need actually to be necessarily either the architect or the developer of a project that makes the application. But it does have to be somebody who is associated with the project in some way. It can't just be some random person, third party in the public. But as long as you have an interest in it, it could be an investor, it could be even somebody who's an occupier, arguably. So it's all fairly interchangeable. And it's actually fairly normal that the person who submits the project will do so, and then somebody else, the developer or investor or another third party, actually pays for it. So there's no requirement that the person who pays the submission fee is the same person that actually files the project itself. Okay, so I don't have any more questions out there. Please fire away. We still have time to go. Here we are. Our project was completed in December 22. It's a commercial building and now has reached 50% occupancy. Should we wait until next year or should we submit this year? Dan, this I think is one for you.
Again, there is an element of subjectivity to this. Percentage of occupancy is relevant, but we like to see it if it is a little bit more fully established, if you will, stabilized. So our view is if you are confident that the 50% occupancy, that the maturity of the project has reached a point where we can visually understand that and how it is performing, then because again, it's not just the occupancy of the building, but how the building responds to the environment, the immediate environment, and the larger the landscape of the city that is in a built environment. So we do not have an issue. In fact, one of the projects did win. It was relatively new. It was just starting to fill up, but the contribution to the area was very substantial. And so we give you latitude for that. However, there is a point in which, and as Colin did mention, we might suggest after your submission that given another year. But by all means, it would not be wasted time if you intend to resubmit it, because a lot of that material certainly can be reused. It is a good exercise to go through in any event. So we don't have an issue, but do be practical about this and make that assessment yourself about it, what its contribution.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue actually in terms of how stabilization relates to what's going on with the pandemic, because of course, particularly in retail and for that matter in office, occupancy will be down because there just hasn't been that much traffic in these buildings. So I mean, what would you say, Dan? Would the jury be willing to cut projects a bit of slack if they see it successful and yet there may have been some...
We encountered that last year, and that's exactly the reason why one of the properties did go through. It didn't win it entirely. It did reach the finals, but I think, irrespective of even the pandemic, you're seeing now that occupancy is very relative. If it's a commercial office project, occupancy could be leases signed for space, but bums on the seat are a different story. So we like to see projects that people are within the premises. Under whatever circumstances, it could be a co-work space where they are, very fluid, or the traditional office where there is quite a mainstream of employees or contractors, people that are actually residing within the building, more on a permanent basis. So we'd like to just see how it performs. And I think that's a pretty easy assessment, even by the developer and the architect. You can tell pretty easily when you believe when a project has stabilized from its performance standpoint, not necessarily from a financial. We will be looking at financial success, but stabilized. And let me add to this. And again, this is a little bit anecdotal. The relevance of the current and the future needs are a part of our assessment. So if it is too young relative to it, we don't really know how there may be some other issues that may actually crop up. And some of the older projects that have been submitted can show that track record of showing, well, this was relevant when we developed the property 5 years ago, but it isn't anymore. But we've already future-proofed our building, and we're able to use these. We've done these particular enhancements, or maybe they didn't have to do much, but it's adopted to the ways in which the future needs are and the requirements of the building have developed.
Yeah. Okay. One more question coming in here. Does it have to be a completed construction project? Is the type of review project an urban renewal type? Because a lot of what we do is at the conceptual solution stage, and it's not actually landed. This can be whether the situation can be submitted or not. So if I understand correctly here, the question is asking, does the construction have to be complete, or can a conceptual project be filed?
We're looking for completed projects. Although we do appreciate in the other areas of the Urban Land Institute, we actually encourage you by all accounts to get engaged with the other parts of the research within the Urban Land Institute. We really enjoy all the contributions that are made by all the professions and all those involved in the built environment. But under these circumstances, our efforts that we're making through and the whole modus operandi of the awards is it should be completed, and we should see what contribution that project makes to the community.
Yeah. And I suppose it's worth underlining here the fact that it does need to be a complete project, because I know there are other competitions out there where if you're at a design stage, then you can just submit the design and your project can be entered for an award. But this one, no, it needs to be completed, not just completed, also stabilized. So it needs to be further down the line probably than a lot of other competitions out there require, at higher standards, I suppose.
Let me add just the part about the ESG and whatever approach and solutions you have. You can tell this has been rising in its importance, and to this extent, we're placing more and more weight on the elements of the ESG. Obviously, the social side of thing has a lot to do with the engagement. We do like to see what events and performances, anything that the developer is going outside of just purely his regular duties as a landlord. We like to see how that's happening in terms of the social side. But the environmental end, any of your efforts in terms of your to reduce carbon, reaching ways in which it can be more self-sustainable, we would very much engage on that. Also, its ability to be transparent to the extent of which it becomes that, not necessarily that we are definitely not in the realms of looking at a project from the corporate side, but we do like to hear that perhaps there would be others that would be participating, that would be benefiting from this, perhaps even on a community basis. We do like to hear about the engagement of those people in the participation of your projects. So a transparent, and certainly that actually helps in terms of the development itself. If in fact you've sought community engagement in the planning and they take some kind of stake and ownership of projects.
Okay, thanks very much for that. One more question coming in here. Is it sufficient to share major financial KPIs, in other words, NOI margin, yield on cost, etc., within the market acceptance section, or will ULI want detailed financial statements? What is the general rule of thumb for this portion of the submission?
We prefer as much information as you can to substantiate it, but again, we're talking about one sheet or a P&L. It would be perfectly fine. But the reality is we do know that this could be a one spot, entry in terms of what you're doing on the application. So if you have the other information, by all means, submit it. It is looked over. We do have a review of those financials as part of it. I wouldn't necessarily say it is weighted as highly as the other parts of what we've discussed today. So but you do need to be as comprehensive as the information you have. And it would not necessarily be a submit or explain approach, but we do like to hear if in fact you don't have anything, you do give some information or feedback about what it is that's preventing you from providing it.
Okay, another question here. What are the best in-class sustainability features that you see that we should work towards?
We've mentioned them. They've all been mentioned in this conversation. So there is no question. And again, just purely if I'm standing from the outside and what Urban Land Institute stands behind, its principles, you look at those relative to the best in class projects that have been submitted already and have won awards. I don't know, in some years we have better awards than we did the year before. Other years it may be a bit during COVID. We did not have as many submissions as we wanted to, and certainly from certain areas, and they were prevented. Likewise, we were not able to see certain projects firsthand. And I think we do need to just touch on, if we have time, about the element of the site visits, which will be in discussion. But as that goes, just by all means go through the relevance of the ULI principles, put emphasis on the fact this is not a design covenant or interiors competition. Look on the positive impacts and what what your project has actually contributed to the community,
Mm.
along with the other aspects we were talking about, relevance, the sustainability, and the
Yeah.
success.
Well, you mentioned there the site visit, Dan. I think it's a good point. Can you explain what you as a juror are looking for in a site visit and what you actually do in most of these cases?
Yeah. Okay, we are led by the applicant first and foremost. We are not necessarily there. This is not an audit. This is not anything relative to anything more we want to make out of this other than just hearing from the relevant parties. We do like to see the developer. We do like to hear from them. So obviously this should not necessarily be an architect or designer or engineer-led presentation. It's a comprehensive one. We like to see the engagement and this element of transparency where we're engaged with the senior people that are involved in the project. If you are making a statement in your presentation, obviously whatever that statement is must be emphasized by within the site tour. And similarly, if you're attempting to avoid certain areas, let me assure you, the professionals who are on the board, we're pretty good at being able to look at 360. Now, obviously, we do need to know if there are any other issues and how they're being addressed. I mean, obviously, we don't necessarily go into too much of the detail. We're really looking at the very much of the broad picture about how it is contributing to the neighborhood. So there may be all kinds of other issues that may exist that may not be relevant, and we're not necessarily want to get too bogged down into the operational issues. Although in some cases those do contribute to a better project, and we do like to hear about the operational end, because it does. We have seen many of them that architecturally they're really not that. They're certainly not something that you would be seeking an award architecturally for, but at the same time, because they make an operational statement and the landlord, developer, and the commitment that's made by those stakeholders is such that we can see that it is making a difference. It really would be the sustainability of that particular operational model, but we can take that as a given. But those things that you're submitting in your presentation are the ones that you need to emphasize. And by all means, if I can just add also on presentations, we have found it as in the jury that if you have that short, now both I'm going to emphasize short video clips that are not just models and people that are put in place, but actual activity within the premises. It's a precursor to the site visit. Those are excellent ways to get the points across, and we enjoy that. Not only enjoy it, but it really does assist us in being able to review and do the evaluation.
Mm. Yeah, it is true. Short videos are actually very useful for the jury. So if you can provide those, then that can be an advantage. Okay, we're running up against time limits now, but I have another question. Can the architect of our project apply for this award instead of the developer and then pay by the developer? I think.
Yeah, we already answered it. We did that.
Yeah, we answered that one already. So the answer is yes. To repeat it in a very concise way, you can do that, no problem. So any more questions? We have another 5 minutes if anyone wants to bring up another topic of discussion, or Dan, if you think there's something we haven't addressed that you think might be useful for people to know.
I think we've practically covered it all. We really want to keep this as simple as possible, although that I agree that the guidelines for your submission are pretty objective. We like to see a little latitude to this, but at the same time, though, the fundamentals of your application are very important. They will be vetted, and we will only see ones that comply with the very basics of your submission. And please submit, like he was saying, in English. And I think it would be ideal that it would be also, if I can suggest, and again, this is nothing more than a suggestion. You do know that there are people that are involved in elements of making presentations. Some presentations come They're very elementary. We do look through it. We do understand them. But obviously, ones that get more attention are the ones that certain professionals that will be involved that have some element of how to present. That is an advantage. It plays in all competitions. And so if those people would be an advantage to you, and obviously your resources can support, then just getting those to be vetted by someone that can polish up presentations, add certain elements of clarification if they see that they don't understand, maybe it will help us understand as well. The way that you answer those questions that they might have.
Yeah, I think Dan's right. It's important to underscore how important the presentation is. This is what the jury will look at. When we go through in each meeting all of the different projects, then what happens is the first thing, the presentation comes on the screen. And then the juror who's assigned the project will talk through that presentation, giving the details that are set out in the application form. So that's what's front and center. Your presentation is always going to be the most important thing. So it is important to make sure that it's good and that it tells your story, because that's basically what it is. And so I can't emphasize enough just how fundamental that is to the overall project. Okay, Dan, I think we could probably continue talking about this all day, but we are pretty much running up against the hour mark. So unless there is any last minute question coming in, then we'll probably draw it to a close here. I can say, I suppose at this point that the deadline for applications is 17th of March. I can say informally that we may be willing to extend that by a day or two in any individual case, because I know these things are a lot of work to create, and it can be a bit overwhelming to get them in at that time. But that's our deadline. The first jury meeting is 29th of March, and we will, after that, let you know the results in the next few days, probably beginning of April. So with that said, I'd like to thank Dan.
By the way, that will be whatever we do convey will be a short list. There will obviously be further other evaluations and site visits after that.
That's right. The first jury meeting will only choose the finalists, of course, and then we have another month for site visits, and then the second jury meeting will actually choose the winners. But we'll notify finalists and non-finalists fairly soon after the first meeting. Okay, I think that does it for now. 10:58, we are just about coming in under the wire. Dan, I'd like to thank you for your time. Some great observations there. And thank everyone here for attending. We will close the webinar now, and hopefully we'll see your applications in the pipeline.
I wish you all good luck in your applications. By all means, give it your best shot.
Okay, goodbye.